Hello and welcome to the second installment of the Religion Teacher's Guide to Lesson Planning video series. My name is Jared Dees. I'll be taking you through the second step of the lesson planning system, creating lesson objectives today. So here again is the overview of the four-step process. Step 1, know the topic. Step 2, create lesson objectives. Step 3, determine the assessment of those objectives. And Step 4, choose the process to reach those objectives. As I said, today we'll be talking about step number 2. So step 2 essentially answers the question, what do I want them to learn? The popular phrase, made popular by Stephen Covey, begin with an end in mind, one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. This is really important in the classroom and in catechesis, to focus on what are your goals, what do you want students to achieve at the end of a session or at the end of a series of sessions within a lesson plan. And essentially, if all else fails and things go completely not according to plan, you can adjust and make sure that you're at least reaching those objectives. Those objectives, the goals that you're setting, that should always stay at the top of your mind and at the forefront of your thoughts and strategies as you're teaching. And these objectives, just to kind of some 3 M's to think about, is when you're creating lesson objectives, make sure that they're meaningful, that they're measurable, and that they make sense to the kids. 3 parts of lesson objectives include the first, SWIBOT, or students will be able to, followed by a learning verb, and this is a verb that's measurable, and then some sort of topic, the topic of the lesson plan. So SWIBOT, a popular phrase, and you probably have seen this quite often in front of lesson plans. SWIBOT stands for, it's an acronym for students will be able to. And this is always starting a lesson objective because you want to focus on, okay, at the end of the lesson, students will be able to do X, Y, and Z. And I prefer students will be able to over students will simply because it again focuses on the goal as opposed to the process, because that's what we want to focus on first. We want to make sure that the objective is there before we start to choose the learning strategies, the things. Many teachers are very good at creating a series of activities and tasks that are related to a topic, but they may or may not have anything to do with an actual goal, or they may just kind of be whatever the teacher or catechist feels like doing that particular day. But if by focusing on a specific goal, it makes all the difference in giving meaning to those activities. And that's what we'll be focusing on later on in step 4. We also want to make sure that we can create a learning objective or lesson objective that is connected to some assessment. So the students will be able to really defines how we will assess what they've learned. And that we'll do in step 3. So here's some examples of what learning verbs might be. So followed by the students will be able to. You have a number of different verbs. Recognize, label. What I don't have on here, but it's probably the most popular, is just to simply explain. Students will explain something. There's just so many verbs you can come up with and use, and it can get kind of daunting and confusing about what verbs to choose and kind of what level of thinking we're focusing on. One thing I've done is tried to simplify what some very prestigious educators have done and made amazing contributions to understanding kind of how people learn. And Benjamin Bloom, there in the middle, Dr. Benjamin Bloom in the 1960s kind of created a taxonomy or some categories for learning verbs with increasing challenge to the kids. He found that teachers are only really assessing at the knowledge or even maybe the comprehension level, and not really encouraging critical thinking of some application skills, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And more recently, Robert Marzano created kind of a new taxonomy with his people, and essentially, he in my mind really helped me to see some better classifications of these different verbs. But you can see kind of with the categories and the subcategories, it can get very confusing, and you can get lost in kind of the minutia of finding the right learning verb. So I simply just kind of created a simplified taxonomy focusing on 3 areas. First, the bottom level, just retrieval or memorization, comprehension or understanding certain things, and then kind of in a large category, of just critical thinking, of encouraging people to go beyond, kids to go beyond just the understanding of something. So how do we create lesson objectives? First, I'd start with the lesson plan objective, or lesson plan template or unit planning template that I provided in the resources. That'll help hopefully create a guide for you and a place to start, or just use whatever lesson planning tools you're using as you are now. Using the notes we created in step 1 during the lesson preparation worksheet, we can create a list of possible lesson objectives that could correspond to the notes that we took. So the reason why we took those notes in the first step was to come back to and create lesson objectives related to what we found out. And 3, select the best objectives and record them in the lesson plan template. And we'll show you how to do that in just a minute. So some of the tools and resources I provided and hopefully you'll be able to use is one is the lesson objectives key, the lesson planning template, or the unit planning template. So let's take a look at those. Here's the lesson objectives key, and essentially what I did was broke down some very common learning verbs and categorized them into retrieval, comprehension, critical thinking to help guide you and give you kind of a key to reference when you're creating lesson objectives. This would be the lesson planning template. Started the lesson plan by titling it Lesson Plan 1 or LP1, you can see here, and we're calling it Love God, referring to the first 3 commandments. It's a part of a larger unit or chapter on the 10 commandments, and I've added a date in here as well, or a series of dates. And so we're going to add in the objectives in this section right here. In step 3, we'll look at the assessment, and we'll attach an assessment that connects to those objectives. And then in step 4, we'll fill out this learning activity spot and try to figure out some actual strategies to reach those objectives and perform well on the assessment. So this is going to be a critical tool, this lesson objectives key, to be able to find the right learning verbs to connect to our topic. So here's what we worked on in the first step. This is the notes we took on kind of an imaginary chapter in a book, or some drawing from some of our standards in a curriculum. We kind of found that these are the 4 main terms of the section. These are some of the main ideas about the first 3 commandments being connected to Jesus' response to what is the greatest commandment. Of course, he said to love God and love your neighbor. And what he did there essentially was summarize the 10 commandments with just those 2 greatest commandments. So that's kind of the focus of our lesson, and we have, again, here we noted a couple of critical thinking opportunities that we can come back to as well. And so these things will be really critical in determining, what do I actually want the students to learn? Because you could go to a number of different ways. You could choose a number of different topics and focus on in the lesson, but we want to make sure that there is some consistency in the approach that we take to teaching. So first I'm going to think of some basic retrieval objectives. These are things that would require the kids to know and memorize and be able to kind of repeat what you've taught them or what they've learned. This is most commonly what kids do when they memorize definitions of key vocabulary terms. And that's most likely going to be the objective we choose. So I'm going to look over here in the lesson objectives key, and I'm going to see that here's some possible starters for the lesson objectives. So I'll come over here to the objective section of the template, and I'll type, okay, students will be able to, let's say, list the first 3 commandments. That's a very important thing to do, but kind of a basis for the rest of the lesson, and a good starting point. As far as a comprehension objective, we might go into the list, and what you could do is essentially just start writing objectives. Start writing summarizes this, paraphrase this, or describe the key parts of. Just kind of brainstorm a number of all the possible different objectives that you might have. If we're looking at this, the notes that we took in step 1, it's probably likely that not only are we going to ask them to memorize and list the first 3 commandments, we're going to have them paraphrase the first 3 commandments in their own words. Again, this is going a step further than just memorizing thou shalt not, etc. and putting it in their own words that they can understand. But we probably want to add an additional objective, because one of the main concepts of this lesson is really the connection between the Ten Commandments and Jesus' commandment, the greatest commandment, to love God and to love your neighbor. So we also want to add in maybe a comprehension objectives that something like describe the ways in which Jesus summarized the first 3 commandments with love God. And so we'll have some ways of asking the students to describe that and show that they understand that Jesus was making that connection. And we could probably go even a step further in kind of basing it off of these other 3 objectives, other 3 ideas, is creating an opportunity for kids to think critically about this topic. And probably the most common one in here, we have at least 2 main ideas of the first 3 commandments in the Old Testament in the Decalogue, and then the greatest commandment that Jesus quotes from the Shema. And we're going to say, okay, why don't we have the kids compare and contrast the first 3 commandments and the greatest commandment, to love God. And there's a number of things we could possibly ask them to do there in a basis for kind of a context in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and we can give them some different ideas for doing this. And the next step, what we'll be doing is looking at the assessment itself, is what are we going to choose that will attach to these objectives. And typically this wouldn't take a whole lot more time. When we create the objectives, we're very likely already having in our mind some actual activities that they could do to measure or show the teacher, show you that they have learned this, that they're able to list the first 3 commandments, paraphrase the first 3 commandments, describe the ways in which Jesus summarized the first 3 commandments, and to compare and contrast the first 3 commandments and the greatest commandments. And after we've done that, we'll go into the actual learning activities to get kids through a process that will help them reach the objectives and help them perform well in the assessment.